Political patterns and processes. A lot of vocabulary in this unit, so let's start at it here. First one, definition of a state. Seems really simple, right? Define boundaries, different population sovereignty over its domestic and internal or international affairs, recognized by other states. Well, you better look at the definition of sovereignty then. However, political unit to look at its own affairs. So this gets to be really complex because that recognized by other states is hard, and sovereignty is really hard, and borders is really hard. Why borders? They're not always agreed upon. Even the United States and Canada have a little bit of a boundary dispute. But I mean, that has long been one of the sources of war in the long term. But then if you look at sovereignty, that's where this, and recognized by other states, that's where it even gets to be more complex. Let's look top middle here. I think we all agree that China is a state. By any rational definition, China is a state. Is Taiwan? By any rational definition, it's a state, except by the recognized by other states, because nobody will recognize it because of China and the relationship that they have. Hong Kong and Macau. And so Taiwan is not a state, but it functions as one essentially. Hong Kong and Macau, are they states? No, they're not. For a long time after they were turned over from the British and Portuguese, respectively, Hong Kong and Macau functioned under the one city, two systems, also known as two cities, three systems. Um, China is now putting more influence there as time has moved forward, but they're really not. But they do function kind of like one. How about this one? Western Sahara. And Morocco claims this as a colony, but nobody else recognizes that claim. And so it kind of functions as a state. It gets to be really complex. I mean, yes, China's a state, but then you have these places like Zakistan, which is a random guy in Utah, or Sealand, which is a little more to it, and go look up both of them as you want, where by no rational definition they're a state, but they claim to be. What makes a state a state? Basically, everyone else has to agree to it. Greenland has complete control over its domestic affairs, no control over its international affairs. So Greenland is not a state. How about Korea? Notice I said Korea, not North and South, because as of the time of this video, North and South Korea function as two states, but are technically, and really only technically, one state because, well, the Korean War never had a peace treaty. Other ones, Kosovo. Basically, most people recognize it except Serbia, and therefore Russia doesn't either. How many? Somalia. Somaliland, they have self-declared independence and has basically been functioning as a state for a long period of time. How about this one? South Ossetia. Russia claims it's a state, Georgia does not. In other words, it's really hard. Now, a state is a political unit, where a nation is a group of people. So you can see here nations share a common cultural heritage, have a belief in values that unify them, claim a particular space as their homeland, and desire or have their own state. The key is here, it's a group of people. So, for instance, go back to China. China is a state. It's also most people would consider it a nation. Hong Kong, not a state, but then Hong Kong does things very differently than China, and their people are very different. What was the other one I wanted? Here we go. Other nations. Nineveh up here in they're basically natives and indigenous people to Canada. They are a nation, very unique. Canada has multiple, basically any Native American group you're going to come up with is also a nation. How about in Spain? You have the Basques. I'm sorry, the Basques up here. You have the Catalonians here. You have the Spanish here. You have the Gaelics. I mean, there's multiple nations within Spain. That's where you start to see this. And now, if you're a nation state, that means the borders of the nation and the borders of the state are approximate are the same. So, for instance, Portugal is a pretty good example. There's no perfect example of a nation state in the world, but there are multiple places that are close. Portugal is one of them. At the borders of this nation and the borders of the state. By the way, this is a language map of Europe. And here's a bunch of definitional pieces with a nation state. The key is you need to have some, so like some people are like, what about ethnicity? The big difference between ethnicity and nation is that you have to have some sort of political strand to it. It's a certain territory that belongs to an ethnicity. So like African American is a ethnicity. I've never heard territorial claims with that. A nation would be a step beyond that. So a nation would be, if African Americans started to claim that, hey, this territory is ours and ours only, yep, then it would be a nation. But so most Native American groups are nations. And if you have your own political entity, then you're a nation state. which we'll come back to here in a second, because one of these is an autonomous region. And this is where you look at Native American reservations in the United States. They are basically semi-autonomous. They have some autonomous within them, but they're essentially still under the United States guidelines. An autonomous region would be like Hong Kong and Macau. Autonomous region would be, the best example of this is the Kurds. I move forward here. Kurds have basically had autonomous regions in Syria, Iraq, somewhat Iran, but not nearly as much, and Turkey for a long period of time. They're an example of a stateless nation. They have no states of their own, but it is a nation. You can see here there's multiple different things here. So back to the autonomous region, there's what Kurdistan would love to have if they had their way about it. There's just another example of it. The stateless nations. You go back to China, where China's going to show up a bunch. The Uyghurs, a Muslim minority group in the Xinjiang province. Tibet, down here in the southern part. Taiwan would be considered a stateless nation as well, although it essentially functions as a state amongst itself. 3 other parts here: multiple state nation, multinational state, multi-ethnic state. Multi-state nation, one nation, Koreans in multiple states. Next, Russia is a multinational state. Most countries in the world are multinational states. If I go back to this one, there is no complete perfect example of a nation state in the world. Japan is the best example, with Iceland not far behind. And this map's a little dated at this point. Like, I would not consider Germany a nation state at this point anymore. Most countries would be in yellow. But then many countries in the world are also multi-ethnic. Let's go to that as well. Let's come back to multiple national state: Scottish, Welsh, Northern Ireland within the United Kingdom. Now, the last one is this: the United States fits multiple definitions, fits both the multinational and the multi-ethnic definition. Why? There's multiple ethnicities living in the United States, as seen by this map. But then you also have multiple nations. There are 2 reasons why the United States fit the multinational definition, where you have different nations living within it. You should have already gotten one, because we talked about it. That is Native Americans. But there's one more. Can you think of it? Now, some of you might be thinking, what about Texas? Is Texas an example of what makes the U.S. a multinational state? You could go there. I would not consider it big enough to the movement within Texas to become its own state, and the same with California. The one I'd actually go with is Hawaii, where they have way more of a tradition, the indigenous population, of becoming their own state. When the United States basically annexed Hawaii back in the late 1800s. I was going to say 19th century. So, multi-state, multi-ethnic, or multinational. Belgium would definitely be multinational, where you have the Wallonians in the south and the Flemish in the north. I would probably go Switzerland as being more multi-ethnic. And remember, the difference in definition between an ethnicity and a nation is just the group of people that have all those shared beliefs coming together. If I go back to this, all of these being true except territory. So, and I would just call it political desire to have their own land. And so for this, you should know the definition of ethnicity from this one, and there's a lot of definitions here, and you should know all of them with examples.